motherfucking cool. Come on. Yes, yes. I love it. Don't be shy, shit. It feel good. Well, alright then.
In the culture, form, and music of hip-hop, emotions and issues of life are expressed. Every artist that participates in the culture brings in their own voice that shows where they come from. A movement similar to this art form, another sociological advancement that broke out from racial oppression and discrimination, is jazz. In the early 20th century in New Orleans, a music was born from African and European musical traditions that incorporated elements of improvisation, syncopation, and polyrhythms. As jazz historian Ken Burns said, jazz was born in New Orleans and grew up in 1,000 different places. Like hip-hop, jazz has multiple subgenres such as Dixieland, big band swing, Afro-Cuban, bebop, and many more that are still expanded today by new generations. Every new environment adapted a different take on the musical form. Like language dialect, even players playing the same thing would play it with different inflections and style that made their voice individual. This musical form was used as declaration for African Americans' trouble with racism, oppression, and segregation. Every artist brought their own personality into their music.
And straight jazz became hot, thanks to a few musicians whose remarkable improvisations gave jazz a new lease on life. Listen to Django Reinhardt. It's the same melody, but what a difference in interpretation. These three musicians.
And this is what the jazz culture has created. Hip-hop was born in the Bronx in the 1970s and grew up in many different places. Like jazz, the multiple subgenres of hip-hop are the modern voice of the ignored racism and oppression problems that were assumed to have disappeared after the Civil Rights Movement. Ironically, when jazz was at its height. Hip-hop was the first music since jazz to have such a strong bass and rhythm, using sonically and harmonically unrelated sounds. Like jazz, hip-hop uses the improvisation of words and vocal dialect, such as scatting, which is a common thing used in jazz. A famous jazz trumpeter named Wynton Marsalis says, "Improvisation is a part of life. If you were a slave out in the cotton fields, you had to improvise to survive. If you didn't adapt to your surroundings quickly, you wouldn't stay alive." Improv in music was really brought forth by jazz and Latin music. Improvising creates a unique moment that will never take place in the exact same way again. To me, jazz and hip-hop have its differences, but are not separated by a genre. They are both just reflections of people and history, as well as economic, social, and technological advancements that have taken place. Both movements carry on a way of life that surpasses just the music. Jazz has had the dominance of popular music, like hip-hop does now. Hip-hop and jazz have always had the tension between being popular music and an art form. Additionally, both forms of cultural expression are dominant in the underground music scene and carry on the legacy of the truthful and honest music that started it all. When jazz came out, with the majority of the people being used to classical music, it was frowned upon as devil's music. Much of the same reaction happened with hip-hop, especially with the music's influence on the younger generation to act against authority as it spread. Although not nearly as much violence came from jazz as it did from hip-hop, it was still a drastic change from the music at the time. Not only are the musical styles alike one another in cultural aspects, but resemble each other in their musicality. So, hip-hop and jazz, they have very similar elements of swing and swinging the rhythms that are expressed. And a good example between swinging music and non-swinging is like, say you're playing, beats 1, 2, 3, 4, you're just playing out straight. It'd be like 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. And then with the same thing, if you were doing swing, it would kind of sound like this: 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. And you're kind of just making the upbeats just a little bit louder than the downbeats, and that gives it a very strong momentum and a swinging element that is very common. And also, both hip-hop and jazz, they accentuate beats 2 and 4 very heavily. So an example of that would be like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And I mean, in layman's terms, you're just making beats 2 and 4 louder. That's a very common thing that's in a lot of hip-hop today. Hip-hop and jazz are some of the few genres that America can claim to have created. With them being so similar, it is inherent that they fit together. In a huge array of modern jazz as well as hip-hop artists, they have been combining the two elements.
Fish?
Yeah.
Only?
Yes.
Hip? Hip-hop? Hip-hop Anonymous?